It's 7 p.m. Monday, August 19th, here in Seoul.
Coming up on News Center tonight. President Moon Jae-in voices concerns over North Korea's latest missile launches, while also calling for efforts to keep the denuclearization dialogue alive with the North.
A busy week of diplomacy lies ahead for South Korea, from defense cost-sharing talks with the US to Washington's top nuclear envoy visiting Seoul. The top diplomats of South Korea and Japan will also sit down for talks in the middle of the week in Beijing in a bid to ease tensions.
South Korea officially demands Japan to present a clear and detailed plan of how it'll clean up the vast amount of radiation-contaminated water from Fukushima nuclear disaster. Japan says there is no final plan yet.
And hundreds of thousands of anti-government protesters continue to march through Hong Kong. The rallies have become more peaceful, but tensions still linger. We take a deeper look into the issue from an expert on the ground. News Center begins now.
Good evening and welcome to Arirang News Center, live from Seoul. I'm Han-daeun.
And I'm Noaram. Thank you, as always, for joining us this evening. We begin at South Korea's top office. President Moon Jae-in has once again highlighted the importance of dialogue with North Korea, urging countries involved to seize what he described as possibly the last opportunity to achieve peace on the Korean peninsula.
The plea came in a meeting with his top aides today, where he also urged all parties to avoid actions that could get in the way of peace efforts. Our Park Hee-jun starts us off.
President Moon Jae-in has called on the relevant parties to make the most out of the resumption of dialogue with North Korea, amid anticipation that the North and the U.S. could soon sit down for negotiations. During a meeting with his senior aides on Monday, President Moon said this is a miraculous opportunity, the product of determination by the leaders of South Korea, North Korea, and the U.S. He urged the countries involved to try to understand the other's stance and to avoid any kind of action that undermines such efforts.
이 기회가 무산된다면 언제 다시 이런 기회를 만들어낼 수 있을지 알 수 없습니다. 대화에 도움이 되는 일은 더해가고 방해가 되는 일은 줄여가는 상호 간의 노력까지 함께 해야 대화의 성공을 거둘 수 있을 것입니다.
President Moon did not directly address it, but his remarks are seen to reflect his concerns over the North's recent projectile launches and harsh rhetoric towards the South. But he also said that progress is being made, which, according to a senior official at the Blue House, is referring to the historic meeting between himself, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and President Donald Trump at the demilitarized zone in June. And he said if there are further positive developments in Pyongyang-Washington negotiations, this could help inter-Korean talks. During Monday's meeting, the president also reiterated that establishing a peace economy with North Korea is the main challenge and opportunity for South Korea.
광복절 경축사에서도 말씀드린 바와 같이 평화 경제는 우리 미래의 핵심적 도전이자 기회입니다. 그러나 우리가 평화롭고 강한 나라가 되려면 결코 포기할 수 없는 일입니다. 북한으로서도 마찬가지입니다.
Moon has been repeatedly pointing to a peace economy as a solution against Japan's trade measures and as a way to leave behind the 70 years history of conflict and distrust and change the destiny of the Korean peninsula. Despite the range of challenges, President Moon vows that his government will continue to work toward a peaceful and prosperous Korean peninsula. He says he will make it a land of prosperity that can one day contribute to the co-prosperity of Asia and the global community. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
A series of diplomatic issues are lined up for South Korea this week, from defense cost-sharing negotiations with the U.S. to a visit by America's top nuclear envoy, Stephen Biegun. The fate of Seoul-Tokyo Military Information Sharing Pact will also be decided this week, which will likely depend on the outcome of the two nations' foreign ministers' meeting set for Wednesday. Our Yoon Jung-min has the details.
Officials from South Korea and the U.S. are meeting in Seoul on Tuesday for talks on sharing the cost of stationing American troops on the peninsula. The South Korean Foreign Ministry's delegate Chang Won-sam will meet his American counterpart Timothy Betts. They were the chief negotiators in the previous talks on the 10th Special Measures Agreement, a defense cost-sharing deal signed in March for keeping the roughly 28,000 U.S. troops stationed in the south. Seoul has agreed to pay nearly $858 million for 2019. The deal expires this year and talks will start soon on the next deal. Chang and Betts won't be directly involved in negotiations for the 11th SMA. New teams will be formed to lead the talks from both sides, but they will be exchanging views ahead of that. Some sources say Washington has asked Seoul for nearly $5 billion, which should be a sign that the negotiations are going to be tough. In the meantime, the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, will be in Seoul on Tuesday, the day the South Korea-U.S. joint military exercise wraps up. Before he gets here, he'll be meeting with his counterpart in Japan as well to strengthen coordination with both countries, North Korea's complete denuclearization. The North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has told President Trump in a letter that he would like for negotiations to resume as soon as the joint drills are over, raising hopes for some progress in the talks. This Saturday, on August 24, the South Korean government will decide whether or not to terminate its military intelligence sharing pact with Japan amid Tokyo's export restrictions. That pact is automatically renewed every year unless either party notifies the other that it's quitting. Meanwhile, the Japanese Foreign Ministry said on Monday that the foreign ministers of South Korea and Japan, Kang Kyung-hwa and Taro Kono, will sit down for separate bilateral talks on Wednesday in Beijing. They'll both be there for three-way talks with their Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. Kang will be heading for Beijing on Tuesday. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
It's been over 8 years since a tsunami caused the meltdown of reactors in the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan. And more water is being contaminated every second. Amid reports that Japan might discharge the vast amount of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean, South Korea has officially voiced concerns, urging Japan for a clarification. Our Lee Ji-won at the Foreign Ministry.
South Korea has urged Japan to give a clear and detailed plan of how it'll clean up the contaminated water from Fukushima. Seoul's Foreign Affairs Ministry summoned Tomofumi Nishinaga, Japan's economic minister, at the Japanese embassy in Seoul on Monday to relay the government's grave concerns about the water and reports that Japan is planning to release it into the Pacific Ocean. It urged Japan to clarify its position on a report from Greenpeace, saying Japan has decided to discharge more than 1 million tons of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean, which would cause serious damage to the whole ocean and to neighboring countries. It then called on Japan to lay out its plans to deal with the issue and share them with the international community. According to a senior official at Seoul's foreign ministry, the Japanese official said he will deliver Seoul's concerns to Tokyo, but he also said that Greenpeace does not represent the Japanese government's official stance. The South Korean official told reporters that discharging the water into the ocean is one of the 6 ways Japan has mentioned before, though it seems like it's not yet been confirmed. Treating and then releasing water is a common way used by many countries to get rid of contaminated water cheaply and quickly. But the South Korean official added that Japan's proposed use of that method is causing protests around the world because so much contaminated water has never been released before. Other things it proposed as a possible solution, the official said, were to evaporate it or store it for longer. The official said Japan told Korea in July that first it's still coming up with a solution and a schedule for dealing with the issue, and that it'll keep the international community up to date. In the meantime, it said it's working on a range of measures such as creating more storage space. But the concern is that storage space will reach its limit of 1.37 million tons in 2022. Seoul's foreign ministry said Monday that it offered to work with Tokyo to find a solution, and the two sides have also been reportedly discussing the formation of a bilateral consultative body on the matter since last year. This comes a week after Seoul's foreign ministry unveiled what it's doing to solve this issue and urged Japan to clean up its toxic water. Lee Ji-won, Arirang News.
A South Korean lawmaker has called for import restrictions on Japanese processed foods from areas affected by the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. Citing reports from the Food Safety Ministry earlier today, Kim Kwang-soo said 35 cases of high levels of radiation were found in roughly 16,000 imports from regions surrounding the power plant. Kim said the current ban on imports of all fishery products from 8 prefectures around Fukushima, which has been in effect since 2013, is not enough for public safety. The government is pushing to create an inter-ministry committee to oversee measures aimed at boosting the competitiveness of South Korea's parts, materials and equipment industries. Trade Minister Song Yun-mo made the remarks earlier today in a meeting with ruling party lawmakers while explaining plans to help those industries deal with Japan's trade curves. Here he is speaking this morning.
For the effective and continuous implementation of policies, we are seeking to establish a government-wide committee. We are also pushing to revise special acts for the parts, materials, and equipment industries. The government is working with related ministries so there are no supply problems. We think this is an opportunity to fundamentally boost our competitiveness.
He added that the government is almost done getting ready to waive the preliminary feasibility studies required for big budget projects in those industries. It's hoped that'll speed up improvements to their competitiveness because until now, projects getting more than $24 million from the government had to carry out those tests to prevent waste. Ruling party lawmakers said they'll visit more small and big companies to hear what they make of the government's plans and take their demands into consideration when deciding on future support. Japan's trade balance posted a deficit in July for the second time in 2 months. Tokyo's finance ministry says Tokyo posted a trade deficit of $2.3 billion last month. Weak exports to China out of trade tensions between Beijing and Washington are seen as the major cause of the decline. Exports to China fell more than 9% compared to the previous year. The country's exports to Korea also decreased by almost 7% on year. The ministry said that it couldn't identify whether Tokyo's recent trade restrictions on Korea had affected the trade balance figure since there was no separate data for the affected materials. South Korea's trade ministry has come up with a strategy for industry and trade to guide the country through the changes to come in the global value chain over the next 1 or 2 decades. Hong Yu explains.
South Korea's Trade Ministry has proposed a national strategy project to increase the country's advanced material and equipment production capability within the global value chain. South Korea's exports rely heavily on the global value chain, or GVC, where products manufactured involve specialized activities in several countries. Only 3 countries are more reliant on the global value chain, but the GVC has been changing with the 4th Industrial Revolution and the changing global trade environment. The Trade Ministry says that global value chains are becoming regionalized, with U.S. President Donald Trump trying to keep the GVC of U.S. products within North America. China is keeping its GVC within China, Japan within ASEAN, and Germany within the EU. China's increasing self-sufficiency of components amid the trade dispute with the U.S. has become a crisis and also an opportunity for South Korea. The ministry's proposal focuses on forming a new GVC that can increase the exports of materials and equipment to China, as they will continue to import such items from abroad. It also said the government should promote M&As and innovation to adapt to the changing global value chain. This proposal was taken into account when the government announced measures to eliminate the country's external dependent industrial structure as part of its efforts to cope with Japan's recently imposed export curbs. Meanwhile, a support team created by the government has started helping businesses that are affected by Japan's export curbs. This team will focus on using extra funding, tax relief, and deregulation to ease the burden on South Korean firms. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
Shifting gears now, another pro-democracy march took place in Hong Kong over the weekend for the 11th week over the now-suspended extradition bill. But unlike the previous demonstrations, Sunday's gathering was peaceful. Kim Da-mi has the latest.
Braving torrential downpours, hundreds of thousands of people returned to the streets of Hong Kong, this time at Victoria Park. The park was the starting point of the huge peaceful marches in June. As protesters planned, the march remained peaceful throughout the day for the first time in 4 weeks. There was no use of tear gas by the police, and people freely marched through the city with their umbrellas, including through the Causeway Bay and Wanchai areas. The police did approve the Sunday rally, but still didn't allow a march through the central district, fearing possible clashes like before. But protesters marched anyway. According to the organizers, around 1.7 million people participated in the demonstrations, but police tallied the number far lower at 128,000 people. The protest began back in June over a controversial but now scrapped extradition law. But demonstrations now focus on 5 demands based on greater democratic freedoms, including the formal withdrawal of an extradition bill and an independent inquiry into alleged police brutality.
The campaign has the support, but the government doesn't. So we urge that Carrie Lam must listen to people's voices and implement the 5 demands, and also ask the police to revisit, to reconsider their strategies against protesters.
Fortunately, China's military, which was seen conducting exercises near Hong Kong, did not intervene in Sunday's protest. But concerns remain that the Chinese government may use military from the mainland to crack down on the protesters. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Let's now take a deeper dive into the situation in Hong Kong with the help from an expert who's there on the ground. And for that, I'm pleased to have Dr. Ming Sing, Associate Professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology's Division of Social Science, joining us on the phone in Hong Kong. Professor Sing, thank you for coming on tonight.
And you're welcome.
Now, let's go back a bit. These mass protests have been sparked by a controversial extradition bill, which has now been put on hold or is dead, as Chief Executive Carrie Lam stated last month. The discontent over China's influence on the city is very much apparent. What started as opposition to the bill has now evolved to citywide and weekly protests calling for reform. What are the issues fueling these protests?
I think there are multiple issues. Obviously, one of the issues is the sharply escalating use of excessive force by the Hong Kong police, which has been, to some extent, certified by the Amnesty International in Hong Kong. Because on June 9th, the Amnesty International pointed out that 15 videos it has examined clearly show that the police has used excessive use of force. And then in another incident in July, there has also been widespread evidence that there was a collusion between the police and some local gangsters or mafia in trying to discourage the movement from continuing. So besides the 5 demands, the alleged collusion between the police and the state, okay, which try to collaborate and try to defeat the movement, has aroused great sympathy, anger, and feeling of injustice. And those feelings have kept up the movement.
Right, there have been reports that the Chinese military may get involved. How do you see these reports, and do you think there will be any kind of military intervention?
I think the chance is very slim because, number one, it is not necessary, okay? It has been argued by a local scholar that the Chinese has already sent 2,000 plus police force into Hong Kong by mimicking as Hong Kong policemen. And number two, I think China is well aware of the fact that the whole world is watching, including the United States. Donald Trump said within the last 4 hours that should the Chinese government use army to crack down bloodily in Hong Kong, then there will be no trade deal between the United States and China. And then other Western powers have also given a very serious warning that violence should not be the way out. So, there's also another very powerful fact that Hong Kong remains the top spot in internationalizing renminbi. Okay, it accounts for internationalizing more than 70% of renminbi around the world. And Hong Kong also remains the top spot in helping to find the capital for Chinese companies. The Chinese companies have raised more capital from Hong Kong alone in the last 7 years than in mainland China, okay, all added up all together. So it will be a lose-lose game should Beijing try to crack down, okay? That would be to no one that will be a completely suicidal tactic.
Right, it's been 11 weeks of protests, just under 3 months since these protests have started. When and how do you expect this issue to be settled, and when do you think Hong Kong will be able to return to normalcy?
I think the ball is now in the court of Beijing because, as you have just reported, yesterday, allegedly there were 1.7 million protesters. The figure given by the police actually was only referring to the one who entered the park at the beginning. The police acknowledged this morning that they have never counted the total number of protesters walking on the street and entering the park in many hours after the beginning of the walk. So as we can see, I would not be surprised to see that yesterday there were at least 1 million protesters coming out again in a very peaceful, non-violent manner, which shows the stamina, the momentum of the general public. I think the general public have been really angered by the lack of real commitment on the part of the Hong Kong government and the Beijing government to withdraw completely the draconian bill, which would endanger the rule of law and freedoms in Hong Kong. And they were equally angered by the widely perceived police and mafia collusion in Hong Kong. And not to mention that they were really afraid that Hong Kong would be transformed from what we call a hybrid regime to an entirely authoritarian regime. Because once the law is passed, then the rule of law in Hong Kong would collapse, and even the freedom from fear would vanish. So that's why the momentum of the movement has been kept on and on without a halt. So the ball is really on Beijing's in the court of Beijing.
Right, Dr. Ming Sing, I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for you tonight. Do stay safe out there, and hopefully we can speak to you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, as the protests in Hong Kong continue, it seems a growing number of locals are seeking to relocate to nearby countries. The South China Morning Post reported Sunday that the number of Hong Kong residents who applied to live or stay in Taiwan increased by nearly 46% in June and July this year compared to 2018. As of mid-August, over 2,000 Hong Kongers filed an application, with nearly all of them approved. The paper said Taiwan's immigration authorities are speeding up the processing of their documents, encouraging Hong Kong people and students to apply for short-term stays. In other news, some analysts think North Korea might be almost ready to deploy the new weapons system it's been testing for the past several weeks. But with joint South Korea-US military drills ending tomorrow, eyes are on whether the North will stop its tests. Oh Jung-hee has more.
North Korea seems set to deploy new types of short-range projectiles after a series of tests over the past few weeks. On Saturday, the state-run Korean Central News Agency reported that the regime tested a new weapon the previous day, and Kim Jong-un personally oversaw the launch. The report didn't provide any details about the weapon itself, but revealed 6 photos of it, which showed the same new weapon the regime tested the week prior. The weapon is assessed by military experts as North Korea's version of ATACMS, a surface-to-surface tactical missile system developed by the U.S. It carries several hundred rounds of submunitions, which can level an area as large as 3 to 4 soccer fields. The North's test fire of the new weapon comes in addition to its test of a new guided multiple rocket launcher and a new short-range ballistic missile that resembles Russia's Iskander and has a pull-up maneuver. Pyongyang claims that all the tests were successful, which points to the possibility that deployment of the weapons could be drawing near. North Korea has stressed its recent missile tests are an eye-for-an-eye move against the South Korea-US joint military exercises. Over the weekend, it once again emphasized it needs to deploy some, quote, powerful physical means to counter potential threats. But as the Seoul-Washington Combined Command Post training wraps up on Tuesday, eyes fall on whether the North will stop missile testing as well. South Korea's intelligence authorities say the North is carrying out back-to-back test firings at this time because it won't be able to once working-level denuclearization talks with the U.S. get underway when the drills are over. 오정희, Arirang News.
It's now less than 100 days until the city of Busan hosts a special group summit with Southeast Asian countries. The members of ASEAN and South Korea will be looking to expand trade. And there's a chance that North Korea's Kim Jong-un might be invited. Here's our chief political correspondent, Shin Se-min.
The 100-day countdown is on for the special summit with ASEAN member nations. The Korea Association of Southeast Asian Nations Special Summit is set for 2 days from November 25th, and the inaugural Korea-Mekong Summit taking place a day later on November 27th. The summit, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the establishment of official dialogue between South Korea and ASEAN, will be the third of its kind to be held in South Korea after the first in 2009 and second in 2014. President Moon Jae-in has placed great attention on advancing relations with ASEAN as a way of expanding South Korea's diplomacy, which has long been primarily focused on the four major powers, the U.S., China, Russia, and Japan. Topping the agenda, establishing a joint will to pursue the free trade order against the backdrop of growing trade tensions, including the intensifying clash between Seoul and Tokyo.
South Korea and ASEAN nations will seek ways to expand trade, strengthen free trade order, and to explore ways for shared prosperity through mutual cooperation, especially at a time of heightened trade tensions between major economies.
The meeting will also focus on expanding cooperation with ASEAN nations in regards to the Korean peace process, as well as its support for the so-called peace economy, a term coined by the Moon administration to signify that peace can be promoted through inter-Korean economic projects. And South Korea's presidential office has suggested North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un might be invited to Busan for the ASEAN meeting as a special guest if talks with the U.S. get back on track after a prolonged lull on diplomacy. As for South Korea's top office sending that highly anticipated invitation north of the border to attend a special summit with ASEAN, the presidential office said that all depends on the nuclear negotiations and the progress made between Pyongyang and Washington. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Samsung Heavy Industries has clinched a deal to build 10 crude oil tankers fueled by LNG. The South Korean shipbuilder said today that the deal with an unspecified Oceania-based company was worth $621 million for delivery by 2022. The eco-friendly ships will be powered by liquefied natural gas using the company's own SVU gas technology, which reduces emissions of toxic chemicals by up to 99%. With the deal, Samsung Heavy Industries has secured contracts to build 29 vessels this year, worth a total of $4.2 billion, making it the first company in the industry to reach over half of its annual goal. Speaking to reporters after dining with Apple's CEO, U.S. President Donald Trump said Tim Cook voiced concerns about the impact of U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports and losing competitiveness against Samsung Electronics. Our Kim Hae-sung tells us more.
U.S. President Donald Trump said Apple's CEO Tim Cook made a strong case about the difficulty competing with Samsung Electronics if Apple's products are subject to import tariffs.
One of the things, and you made a good case, is that Samsung is their #1 competitor, and Samsung is not paying tariffs because they're based in South Korea. And it's tough for Apple to pay tariffs if they're competing with a very good company that's not. And I thought he made a very compelling argument, so I'm thinking about it.
Tariffs on an additional $300 billion of Chinese imports, including Apple's consumer electronics goods, are scheduled to go into effect later this year. Tariffs on iPhones and Apple's MacBook laptops have been pushed back to December 15th to accommodate the holiday shopping season, but the levies on the Apple Watch and other accessories are still planned for September 1st. Apple will be hit by tariffs as it assembles the majority of its products in China before importing them to the U.S. Samsung Electronics, on the other hand, has a more diversified supply chain with much of its manufacturing located in South Korea and Vietnam, as well as China, meaning the tariffs will have far less of an impact than they will on Apple.
Tim Cook's intention is to exempt Apple from the 10% tariffs on Chinese imports. Samsung Electronics won't be hit hard as the WTO's Information Technology Agreement keeps smartphones and laptops produced in countries like Vietnam free of tariffs. Trump is unpredictable. He may give Apple a tariff exemption or even look into imposing new tariffs on goods imported from Vietnam or India.
Late last month, Trump had openly refused to exempt Apple from the previous rounds of tariffs on Chinese imports via tweet, saying that Apple could avoid them by shifting production back to the U.S. Given the slight change in tone, it remains to be seen whether the Trump administration will come up with some policy measures to protect Apple. 김혜성, 아리랑 뉴스.
The tensions between Korea and Japan have caused fewer Koreans to travel to the island nation, considered a favorite holiday destination during Korean Thanksgiving. Local e-commerce firm Tmon says over the past 2 years, Osaka was the most popular overseas destination for South Koreans during Chuseok, but the city is now number 6. More than 30% of overseas plane tickets booked last year were to Japan, but this year that figure has fallen to below 11%. Koreans are now choosing to go elsewhere, such as Southeast Asia, or opting to travel locally. North Korea has introduced a new tourism program that hopes to attract more European visitors. According to Pyongyang state-run tour website DPR Korea Tour, the program includes a large gymnastics performance and chartered flights to Baekdusan and Chilbosan mountains. The website posted contact details of the tour agencies it will work with, based in the UK, Netherlands, Sweden and Czech Republic. The new program is seemingly aimed at attracting tourists outside of China, where the majority of visitors to the north come from. Apple has for the first time revealed the number of people it employs in Korea. 500 people directly employed as of June 30th. The figures were posted on the firm's South Korea job creation website. The tech giant also said it's created more than 320,000 jobs in the country, partnering with some 200 local suppliers. The website implies that Apple intends to invest more in South Korea, considering it a crucial market. For the past several years, Apple has opened similar websites for major markets such as the US, Japan and Europe. The Seoul Metropolitan Government plans to add more parking spaces designated only for car sharing. It says every public parking lot with more than 10 spaces will have to set aside at least one spot for the use of the Seoul Nanum car service. The city aims to have 10,000 shared cars on the streets by 2022. Established in 2013, Nanum Car has been growing in popularity, recording more than 210,000 users last year. That has been your 3-minute news flash.
Heat wave advisories were issued in parts of the nation today, but the heat is expected to ease with the upcoming rain this week.
Let's get more from our Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle.
Now, the heat wave advisories were issued across the country today, now especially in the western regions, including the capital. Now, on Tuesday, the weather is expected to stay hot under sunny skies in Seoul, whereas Jeju and the southern provinces are expecting rain into the afternoon. The neighboring countries can also expect steady rain with very cool readings in the 20s for Beijing. Now, tomorrow's rain will spread across Korea from Wednesday through Thursday, bringing up to 80 millimeters of heavy rain, especially along the south coastal areas. Now, after the rain, the heat should ease, allowing us to have cooler air in the mornings and the evenings. And the daytime highs will also fall below 30 degrees mark. And until then, here's how the temperatures look. Seoul will wake up to 22 degrees Celsius tomorrow, while Daegu and Busan hits up to 24, and Jeju still experiencing tropical nights, waking up at 25 degrees. Now, the heat wave will continue to bring scorching weather, with Seoul hitting up to 33 degrees, and it will be cooler for Gyeongju, reaching up to 28, and Busan to 29 degrees. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That will wrap it up for this edition of Arirang News. Thank you, as always, for watching.
News in Depth is next.